Hi all. So we're going to start in about a minute. We're just checking our sound. Rob, Tracy, Kara, and Alan, if you could turn on your webcams. Okay, hi all. Welcome to the second of the 5 webinars that we're putting on that focuses on the SB 1383 tools. For this webinar, we will do a deep dive into the model franchise agreement. As a reminder, the webinars are being recorded and the PowerPoints will also be posted after both are converted to ADA compliance. I will send out a listserv message once they're online so folks know. We will also be taking questions live at the end of this presentation. So if you have a question, please ensure that you're logged on through the GoToMeeting side. If you don't know the link for that, let me know through the SLCP inbox and I could send it to you. If you don't have a question, you could obviously go through the broadcast side for the CalRecycle. Please keep your questions until the end. However, if you use the question feature on the GoToMeeting, please put an asterisk in there and our team will keep track of the way that the questions come in and we will call you once you're unmuted. And again, this happens at the end of the presentation. In order to be more effective, please keep all questions focused on the model tools. For other questions not related to the model tools, feel free to either contact your local assistance representative or email the SLCP inbox. Before we dive into the presentations, I would like to thank HF&H, Deborah Kaufman Consulting, and Divergent Strategies for developing the model tools. Also, I'd like to thank our resource group, as well as all of the CalRecycle staff who contributed to the tools. And now I'd like to turn it to Rob and Tracy, but first I want to give a little background information on both. So for Rob, since 2002, Rob has provided recycling and solid waste consulting services to public agencies covering a range of strategic, operational, programmatic, contractual, and financial issues. Rob leads HF&H's franchising team, supporting over a dozen communities annually in competitively procuring and negotiating collection, processing, or disposal contracts. Rob leads HF&H's 1383 efforts, including direction over 20 1383 projects, such as implementation plans, compliant franchises, compliant ordinances, and the development of the Model Tools project. He's also hosted several 1383 local government summits and has spoken many times to jurisdictions on 1383 compliance. And Tracy Swanborn is a senior manager with HF&H. She has over 30 years of consulting experience assisting local governments. Her expertise is in planning diversion programs, managing competitive procurements for collection, processing and disposal, and developing contracts and ordinances. Tracy has been focused on 1383, actively tracking the rulemaking, presenting requirements to jurisdictions, and assisting jurisdictions with preparation of 1383 action plans and compliant franchises. She managed the development of the 4 model tools, so thank you very much, Tracy, which, as you guys know, include the model franchise, which we'll go over soon, the model ordinance, which we'll go over this afternoon, the model organics procurement policy, which we'll go over tomorrow morning, and the edible food recovery agreement, which we'll go over tomorrow afternoon. So with that said, I'll hand it over to Rob.
Thank you, Ashley. Well, as most of you know, SB 1383 is the most significant waste reduction mandate that has been adopted in California in the last 30 years. The legislation has significant policy and legal implications for both state and local governments, as well as generators and regulated parties throughout the state. to assist jurisdictions with implementing 1383, HF&H consultants in collaboration with our partners at Diversion Strategies and Deborah Kaufman worked with CalRecycle to develop the 4 model tools: the Model Franchise Agreement, Model Mandatory Organic Disposal Reduction Ordinance, Model Organic Waste Product Procurement Policy, and the Model Edible Food Recovery Agreement that we'll be presenting over this series of workshops this week. This presentation is focused on the Model Franchise Agreement tool that's been developed to provide jurisdictions and their service providers with contract language that support their cooperative compliance with 1383 requirements for collection, processing, contamination monitoring, education, record keeping, and many of the other requirements that are within SB 1383. Before we can get too deep into this presentation, we do need to go over some fine print. The model tools were developed for example purposes only. They can't be merely duplicated without consideration of each particular need or circumstance that a jurisdiction or its service provider may have. It's not intended to cover each and every possible situation that folks will come up with as they're implementing SB 1383, nor can it anticipate specific needs that we didn't have case studies for as we considered this. We've done our best to align the model language with the regulations. However, if there is a conflict, obviously the language in the regulations prevails over the model tools, and in those cases, the SB 1383 regulatory language and the official rulemaking record guide the determination of regulatory intent and interpretation. It's also important to note that each jurisdiction is ultimately responsible for its own compliance with the regulations, and they need to seek legal counsel and whatever other support they need to develop and modify these tools, particularly this agreement, to meet their needs. So with that, let's get into our tool. So we're going to start today with an overview of SB 1383 to highlight some of the specific requirements and target dates and roles and responsibilities. Then we'll discuss the objectives of the Model Franchise Agreement tool itself, reviewing how it was developed, how it's structured, and some items that you'll need to consider as you're using it. Then we'll go through in detail the Model Franchise Agreement article by article and cover what the focus is of each article, how you use each article, and what some of the key guidance and customization issues are. So to manage our time, we're going to ask, as Ashley said, to have the questions at the end of the presentation, and we'll allocate as much time as we can for Q&A there. So, as most of you know, SB 1383 establishes organic waste reduction targets. It was building on the mandatory commercial organics recycling law that jurisdictions have been working on since 2016. SB 1383 sets a goal for Californians to reduce the disposal of organic waste by 50% by 2020 and by 75% by 2025. This is against the 2014 waste characterization baseline measurements when about 23 million tons of organic waste were disposed in California. So with these reductions, we should see a reduction of at least 8 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually by 2030. Again, this is a climate bill. This is part of the state's climate solution, right? So that's what we're focused on. In addition, SB 1383 establishes a goal to recover 20% of currently disposed edible food for human consumption by 2025. The SB 1383 definition of organic waste covers many materials. It includes food, paper, cardboard, green waste, wood waste. So it expands beyond the definition we've been paying attention to under AB 1826. These regulations take effect in 2022, and on the next slide we'll talk a little bit about some of the timeline and key dates. So it's important to understand that in SB 1383 terms, a jurisdiction is defined as a city, a county, a city or county, city and county in the case of San Francisco, and special districts that provide solid waste handling services. To meet the regulatory deadline of January 1, 2022, CalRecycle expects that jurisdictions will be planning and making programmatic and budgetary decisions regarding the requirements now. By 2022, jurisdictions will be required to have an ordinance, which we'll be discussing in this workshop series more, have an organic collection service for all residents and businesses up and running, and those organic collection services are to be automatically provided to all residents and businesses if they generate organic waste. to implement edible food recovery programs established for Tier 1 generators by January of 2022 and for Tier 2 generators by January of 2024, to conduct compliant education and outreach efforts, to procure recovered organic waste products and paper products, to assess and plan for organic processing and edible food capacity within your counties. And then in addition, jurisdictions are to conduct monitoring, desk audits, route reviews, and inspections of Tier 1 generators. In the first 2 years of the implementation, jurisdictions are going to be providing education and outreach to non-compliant generators at a minimum. It's important to note that CalRecycle can begin enforcement actions on jurisdictions and other entities in January 1 of 2022. In 2024, jurisdictions will be required to take enforcement actions against non-compliant entities within their jurisdiction. Note that jurisdictions are not required to impose penalties on generators that are found in violation of prohibited container contaminant requirements. CalRecycle does have some funding available through competitive grant programs as well as loan programs for establishing infrastructure for organic waste and recovering edible food. But the programmatic activities, the enforcement, the inspections, the collection services, education and outreach need to be planned into ongoing budgetary and staffing needs that local jurisdictions have. Really, the big takeaway from this is jurisdictions need to start planning now to have all of this in place for January of 2022. The Model Franchise Agreement is a tool that can significantly help jurisdictions comply with the requirements through their arrangements with their service providers, and includes a lot of the features for delegating responsibility to those providers. So let's cover some of the most basic elements of the regulation are that jurisdictions are required to automatically provide an organic waste collection service to each of their residents and businesses. This isn't just the green container, right? The slide depicts the different types of organic waste collection options that are available under SB 1383. The regulations also require all residents and businesses to use an organic waste recycling service that meets the regulatory requirements. Jurisdictions must regulate and have enforceable mechanisms for its haulers that collect organic waste in the jurisdiction and also for generators and self-haulers. There's a lot of detail in this 1383 regulations regarding the types of allowable collection programs. At a high level, they require the following. Each resident and business must be provided and subscribed to an organic waste collection service where the generator source separates the material, or where the service provider transports all unsegregated waste to a facility that recovers a specified percentage of the organic content collected from the system. The regulations allow for a menu of collection items or options, and jurisdictions may use a combination of services. For example, you may have a 3-container system in your residential sector, but a 1 or a 2-container system in your commercial sector. For the 3-container systems, the gray container can be used for landfill-bound material, the blue container for recyclables, which includes the organic recyclables, the fibers, and the green container for food and yard trimmings. In this program, organic waste is required to be source separated, where paper and cardboard is placed in the blue container and the food and the yard trimmings in the green container. There is no specified recovery rate for processing under this system. The 3-container option also allows additional separations. For example, some agencies may use split containers for their recyclables and have the fibers on one side and containers on the other. Similarly, they may separate the food scraps and the yard trimmings, in which case the separated food needs to go into a brown container. If using a 2-container system, at least one of the containers, whichever doesn't contain the source separated material, has to be transported to a high diversion organics processing facility. Similarly, in the 1-container system, the unsegregated container needs to be delivered to a high diversion organic processing facility that recovers the specified amount of organic content. It's also important to note that these same rules apply to entities that are not subject to a local jurisdiction's control. So in these cases, CalRecycle will oversee the state agencies, including UCs, CSUs, community colleges, K through 12 schools, and those other entities that are not subject to local oversight. The model agreement that we'll be talking about today addresses the various types of collection services and provides a lot of options about how those can be customized. Jurisdictions have to also ensure that processing requirements are met. They need to conduct contamination monitoring and report on how they're implementing those requirements, and we'll review how the model franchise agreement provides provisions and customization for those requirements as well. Keep in mind that most of the requirements are tied to the jurisdiction's decision about a collection system and its compliance approach. You'll note that in Article 3, we've got a standard compliance approach, and in Article 17, we've got a performance-based compliance approach, and the model tries to deal with both of those. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy to walk us through the details of the model franchise agreement.
Thank you, Rob. I'll be spending about the next 30 minutes providing a general overview of the franchise and then walking through and describing each of the articles and the exhibits briefly. The objective of the model franchise agreement is to provide jurisdictions, their contractors, and third parties with a tool to support their compliance with SB 1383. Since franchise agreements are commonly used by jurisdictions throughout the state, this model agreement was prepared to support jurisdictions with planning, implementation, and compliance efforts. A franchise agreement, however, is not the only way to accomplish these arrangements. The regulations do allow for this type of regulation to occur through a franchise, a license, or a permit system for haulers. But regardless of the vehicle used, the model franchise will be a good tool to borrow language from to make sure you're covering key SB 1383 regulatory requirements related to compliant collection programs. Throughout the model franchise tool, guidance notes are provided to help users understand the regulations and compliance strategies. Again, I want to emphasize that having a franchise agreement in place is not a specific requirement under SB 1383. Now I'd like to briefly discuss how the model franchise agreement was developed and what you can expect from it. First, we started with the typical agreement framework. We then built the provisions of the agreement out by using actual franchise provisions in many cases. We drew on nearly 24 franchise agreements that include SB 1383 related provisions. In cases where no example language could be found, we drafted new provisions to fill the gaps. The language was sent to a resource group, and additional refinements were made to the model agreement based on the resource group member feedback. Thank you very much to all those resource group members that participated. It was really helpful. The model franchise agreement is organized into two main documents: the main body, which provides the general requirements, and the exhibits, which provide detailed specifications. Keep in mind that we have omitted some boilerplate language and non-SB 1383 related sections, such as rate setting provisions and performance standards. Those are things that you should deal with at the local level and may be informed by existing practice or the negotiation that the jurisdictions will have with their contractors. We designed the model agreement to be flexible for use by a wide range of communities with different contracting conditions, communities with different service needs, and communities with different compliance approaches. We built optionality throughout the model, so there is a lot of choose your own adventure type of language that you can select. Options are offered by including multiple example provisions in dozens of sections throughout the agreement. These options will allow users to pick and choose the language that most closely fit their circumstances and their desired collection approach. Because of the optionality, there is a lot of language that you will ultimately not select and you will need to remove from the model as you work with it. I'd like to note some important considerations to think about as you use the model franchise agreement. The model agreement can be used by jurisdictions that are drafting new agreements and by those amending existing agreements. It is recommended that users consider the use of existing provisions of their agreements subject to review and revision as needed, or as advised to negotiate and adjust provisions to reflect current conditions. For those that are setting out to develop new franchise agreements, the model franchise may be used as a starting point, noting as we discussed that it does not contain example language for all provisions in a typical franchise agreement. And you'll need to pull those from your existing agreement or prepare new sections to fill those gaps. For those amending existing agreements, the example provisions in the model can be integrated into the jurisdiction's existing agreement. In either case, we strongly recommend that you look at the detailed language and not just accept what the model says, but to think about how it will work in your community and edit the provisions as needed. We've provided this model tool to work for all jurisdictions in the state, which means all users will need to make some adjustments and some refinement to meet the specifics of their jurisdictions. And you'll find we've provided a tremendous amount of guidance notes on how to do that. It's important to recognize that each jurisdiction is responsible for understanding and complying with SB 1383. The use of the model franchise agreement does not mean that a jurisdiction's compliant. Those using the model will need to make sure that specific provisions deal with the needs of their specific SB 1383 compliance strategy, and that they have thought through the other requirements of SB 1383 that will not be covered by the agreement. In fact, not all requirements, many requirements can be fulfilled by delegation to collection companies, but not all of them. So jurisdictions will need to recognize that they'll have other activities that they need to complete under SB 1383 to achieve compliance. Any agreement that results from the use of the model franchise should not be considered to have undergone legal counsel review. While the agreement has gone through legal review, it's very important that each jurisdiction works with its legal counsel to perform its own legal review and approval processes that are necessary for that jurisdiction. When amending an existing franchise agreement, it is also advised that the amendment process involves engagement with the involved contractors and negotiation of final terms and conditions suitable for all parties. This process will include the haulers or haulers and may include transfer and processing contractors when those services are handled through separate contracts. This is a two-party agreement, and so it's very important that both parties be involved in the negotiations of the terms and conditions. Lastly, I want to mention that the provisions of the model franchise agreement are examples only. Jurisdictions are not required to use this language, nor include similar provisions in their franchise agreements. The model is provided as a tool. The jurisdiction has a unique way of dealing with requirements. That is okay, and they should proceed in that course. We like to say that the model franchise agreement is a very colorful document. It includes green and blue highlights and blue text, and all of these things have significance. The guidance notes, which are highlighted in green, are integrated into the model to explain how specific sections and provisions of the model can be customized for a particular user's needs. These guidance notes clearly identify what SB 1383 requires and what is optional for consideration by users of the model. Notes highlighted in blue identify various options or areas where specific information is to be inserted or selected by the user. SB 1383 specific regulatory language is shown in blue font. The franchise language that's not specific to SB 1383 is shown in black font, but is typically supportive of SB 1383 and provides additional parameters that are not in the regulations, but are necessary to have in the franchise agreement to make the language operative. In most cases, the black font relates to SB 1383 requirements, and we've tried not to get into areas that are not related to SB 1383. The examples shown on this slide present optional provisions for standard and performance-based compliance approach. SB 1383 regulations define a standard compliance approach, which Rob laid out on the previous slides for organics collection, and that's documented in Article 3 of the regulations, and a performance-based compliance approach, which requires use of a 3-container system and compliance with some other specifications, and that's documented in Article 17 of the regulations. Throughout the model franchise, we have included optional language for each of these approaches and guidance notes when certain provisions should be included or excluded depending on which compliance approach the jurisdiction is using. The manner in which a jurisdiction contracts for collection, processing, and disposal services will impact the necessary provisions of the agreement. And we recognize jurisdictions do this in different ways. So in a system in which a jurisdiction integrates collection, processing, and disposal services under one single contract, the user of the model will need to include all provisions that cover these services. In systems where collection is handled under a separate contract from processing, transfer, and disposal, the example processing, transfer, and disposal provisions in the model can be omitted. General guidance and optional franchise provisions are presented in the model agreement to give users insight on which provisions to select and adapt for their contract conditions. As noted in SB 1383 regulations, some SB 1383 obligations can be delegated by jurisdictions to others, and other responsibilities cannot. And guidance notes throughout the model explain these various scenarios. For responsibilities that can be delegated to contractors, users of the model agreement are advised to consider which requirements of SB 1383 will remain the responsibility of the jurisdiction and which will be delegated to the franchise contractor or to a third party, or some combination thereof. So for example, we're seeing that some jurisdictions may require their franchise hauler to perform contamination monitoring, whereas other jurisdictions may choose to conduct the monitoring themselves or arrange for the contamination monitoring to be done through a third party. Numerous options are presented throughout the model to address these types of scenarios and more related to different strategies for assignment of responsibilities. Again, the options are highlighted in blue, and guidance notes will explain how to pick and choose those. And those notes are in green highlighting. This slide lists each article provided in the model agreement. There's also 7 exhibits that accompany the model that provide details on collection and processing services, liquidated damages, and reporting requirements. I'll now go through each of these sections to give you a sense of the content and how to use them. Article 1 includes defined terms used in the model agreement. Some of the defined terms have been obtained directly from SB 1383, and they're noted in blue text. Many other definitions are from the example franchises we compiled. Some of the key terms are based on container colors and material types, and we will see some examples on this on the next slide. The nuances of various defined terms and their relationships to one another can have a significant impact on the meaning and the intent of a franchise agreement. For this reason, users are advised to very carefully and deliberately review the definitions of their existing agreements, compare them to the similar terms in the model, modify the existing definitions, and integrate new ones where needed. While the user may modify or create their own definitions, it's important to recognize that the jurisdiction must ensure compliance with SB 1383 requirements. For example, material streams such as green waste or source separated recyclables can be defined and renamed and further subdivided. However, the agreement must assure that all organic waste specified in SB 1383 for collection is collected in a compliant manner. Definitions contain customization options, and those again are highlighted in green or blue. Additionally, the model refers to containers by their colors, gray, green, blue, and brown, as done in the SB 1383 regulations. These definitions will need to be modified if a jurisdiction is using different colors currently. Finally, jurisdictions will need to amend the definitions in their municipal or county code to align with the updated definitions in the franchise agreement and the SB 1383 regulations. A little bit more on the definition. This slide contains the key defined terms that are used in the model agreement for the different material streams. You'll notice that the defined terms for recyclables, organics, and solid waste align closely with the definitions provided in SB 1383. For materials that have traditionally gone in the recyclables containers, there are three key definitions. Source-separated recyclable materials, which is analogous to recyclable materials definition used in many franchise agreements. This term serves as an umbrella term that covers the terms listed below it. The non-organic recyclables refers to materials like glass, metal, and plastic that are not organic but can be recycled. This aligns with an SB 1383 term. Similarly, source-separated blue container organic waste, which is defined by the regulations, refers to organic materials such as paper and cardboard that are typically collected in a recyclable stream. For materials that have traditionally been placed in the organics container, there is one key definition: source-separated green container organic waste, which we often call SSGCal, which refers to organic non-fiber materials such as yard trimmings and wood waste, both of which are also defined terms. Again, this SSGCal is a term used in the regulations. Note that SSGCal is a subset of the definition of organic waste, an umbrella term that includes both green and blue container organics and other organic materials that are not necessarily designated for separation, such as carpet and textiles that are organics. For materials that are typically placed in the solid waste containers, there's two key definitions. For a 3-container system, the solid waste is referred to as gray container waste, again, to align with the SB 1383 defined terms. And for 2 and 1 container systems, mixed waste is the term utilized. You may be wondering why organic waste is not listed as a material collected in the blue, green, or gray containers. Organic waste is an umbrella term. It includes SSBCal, SSGCal, textiles, carpets, and other regulated materials. So it's not called out specifically to be placed in a container. Again, be careful when you're using these defined terms, as they're used in very precise ways. For Article 2, the model does not include sample language for reps and warranties because the provisions do not have direct relationship to SB 1383. Instead, placeholder section headings are provided to signal the type of content likely to be included by jurisdictions in this section. The section should be viewed as a placeholder for the user to incorporate its boilerplate language or language that is advised by legal counsel. For Article 3 of the model, it also includes placeholder sections for provisions that grant the exclusive or non-exclusive rights to the hauler and describes the limitation to the scope of those exclusive or non-exclusive rights. Typically, the limitations of scope provisions of a franchise have very nuanced elements that are unique to each jurisdiction and are also described in the jurisdiction's municipal code. For this reason, it's recommended that each user consider using the limitations of scope section from their current franchise agreement, of course, subject to review and revision as needed, with the exception that jurisdictions may want to include a few new items related to organic waste. And the model language has included 3 new sections that jurisdictions may choose to include, but are not obligated to include in the exclusive or non-exclusive scope of their franchise. The first is an edible food recovered for human consumption. The second is food waste used for animal feed. And the third is organic waste composted at community composting sites. Section 3 also includes a few other placeholder sections to be tailored by the users of the model. Most notably, a placeholder section is included for jurisdictions to describe the term of their agreement, including the initial duration and any extensions thereto. Article 4 covers the general agreements of the contract and of the parties. A key item to consider when crafting Article 4 is how the facilities will be selected and designated in the agreement. In other words, who is choosing the facilities? Example language is provided for scenarios in which the hauler provides transfer processing and disposal facilities, And language is also provided for scenarios in which the jurisdiction provides the facilities or separately contracts for these facility services. An option is also provided for jurisdictions to reserve the right to direct use of jurisdiction-selected facilities in the future. Article 4 includes placeholder sections for subcontracting arrangements and change in scope with guidance notes for users of the model to rely on their existing contract language, subject to review and revision or negotiated changes. Article 5 provides the framework for SB 1383 compliance services. So now we're really getting into the nuts and bolts of the collection program. Jurisdictions can choose language that aligns with their chosen collection system. We have language for the use of 3, 2, and 1 container systems, as well as those that have additional containers, split containers, or include use of plastic bags. A note about the use of plastic bags: they can be used in some instances in addition to the rigid containers. However, there are different requirements based on the type of collection system the jurisdiction uses. And we've provided language for use of plastic containers in 2 or 3 container systems. In this Article 5, there's a lot of specific guidance notes and optionalities highlighted around these various collection systems. As I previously described, SB 1383 focuses on 3 types of compliant collection systems based on the level of source separation or processing. Users of the model are to use the language based on the selected collection system and delete the irrelevant sections. Users may, as Rob noted, rely on different approaches for different sectors. So for example, a 3-container system may be provided for single-family customers and a 2-container for multifamily and commercial customers. If that approach is taken, the user will need to make sure that they include both of those collection systems and clearly identify that one applies to single-family and that the other applies to the multifamily and commercial customers. The provisions in this article assume that the collector will be providing collection containers, and if the jurisdiction chooses to provide or will provide the containers in the future, the language will need to be modified accordingly. We've also provided language that addresses exclusive and non-exclusive franchise systems and systems that are focused on performance-based compliance or standard compliance approaches. And again, these options are flagged with guidance notes and option notes in the green and blue highlighting. If a jurisdiction chooses to comply with the regulations using the performance-based compliance approach in Article 17 of the regs, the jurisdiction is required to provide a 3-container system to at least 90% of the single-family generators and 90% of the commercial and multifamily generators, and these will be measured separately. Article 6 covers other services and includes SB 1383 specific requirements. The article focuses on transfer processing and disposal facilities, subcontractors, and discarded materials facility capacity guarantees. This article also provides language for contamination monitoring, including the methodology and frequency of such efforts. And all of these provisions should be tailored based on the negotiated deal between the jurisdiction and their contractor or contractors. Sections not specific to SB 1383 that are included in this article include billing, collection of abandoned materials, and emergency services. The model recognizes that jurisdictions, as I mentioned, secure transfer, processing, and disposal services using different approaches that impact the requirements of their agreement. Jurisdictions may designate certain facilities to be used, and the hauler may designate other facilities to be used. Within these broader options are more discrete options based on the collection system type. I know this gets a bit complicated, so here's an example. For example, if a jurisdiction is using a 3-container system, they are not required to send gray container waste to a high diversion organic waste processing facility unless the materials include organics. But if a jurisdiction is using a 1 or 2 container system, they are required to use a high diversion organic waste processing facility and will have to include that example language in their agreement. Since multiple facilities can be used to meet the transfer processing and disposal needs, users of the model will most likely use a combination of these approaches, and they'll need to customize the language to fit their specific circumstances. A little bit more on Article 6. Section 6.2 provides detailed language on contamination monitoring requirements. Options are provided for utilization of route reviews or waste evaluations that are allowed under SB 1383. Section 6.3 provides language for contractor responsibilities for education outreach and provides optionality based on whether education requirements are going to be primarily fulfilled by the jurisdiction or a third party, or whether the contractor will be the primary party handling the education. Section 6.5 provides language for contractor responsibilities for edible food recovery. We found some examples in several existing agreements that have covered SB 1383 requirements and present three options: that the contractor cooperates and does not interfere with food recovery efforts performed by others. The second option is that the contractor provides facilitation of food recovery efforts between generators and food recovery organizations. And the last option provides for annual funding that can be directed to the jurisdiction to food recovery organizations and services, or that can be used to support grant funding. And jurisdictions may choose to use a combination of these options, one of these options, or none. It's really up to them. Article 6 also includes provisions describing contractors' engagement with and responsibilities related to inspection and enforcement and handling of SB 1383 complaints. And you'll see, like the other sections, there's a range of options offered that allow for customization. Section 611 provides options for the contractor to provide bulk compost and/or bulk mulch to the jurisdiction to help the jurisdiction meet recovered organic waste procurement targets as required under SB 1383. I want to note that Section 4 addresses contractors' use of renewable natural gas for collection vehicles, which can also support the procurement requirements. Article 7 covers standards of performance and provides two SB 1383 specific sections. The main one addresses SB 1383 container color and labeling requirements. The language in this section assumes contractor provides the containers. As I mentioned previously, if the jurisdiction provides the containers, the provisions will need to be amended. This section includes several options for addressing achievement of compliance with the SB 1383 blue, green, and gray container color requirements if the jurisdiction's containers are not presently compliant. Container labeling requirements are also provided in Section 7.5. And optionality is built in as to whether jurisdictions will require the contractor to label existing containers, provide imprinted or in-mold labels for new containers, or some combination of these two. Guidance notes advise users on how to amend the container section to align with current and/or desired color, compliance, and labeling approaches. The other SB 1383 specific content is provided in Section 7.4 for collection vehicles. This applies to jurisdictions that are requiring their contractors to use renewable natural gas to help meet their recovered organic waste procurement targets. Article 7 also includes placeholder sections for many sections of a typical agreement, such as operating hours and standards, personnel, hazardous waste, diversion requirements, and more, as these sections do not directly relate to SB 1383. It is recommended that users consider use of existing contract provisions subject to review and revision and negotiation. There are a lot of record keeping and recording requirements included under SB 1383, particularly for the standard-based compliance approach in Article 3 of the regs. Article 8 references Exhibit G, where these requirements are outlined in detail. Article 9 covers jurisdiction fees. Some placeholder headings are provided here for jurisdictions' franchise fees and other fees because these fees are specific to each jurisdiction and its negotiations with its contractor or contractors. However, the model does include two example fees that jurisdictions may consider including to fund SB 1383 programs. Specifically, there is model language for an SB 1383 fee and an edible food recovery program contribution. Note that these provisions are not required under SB 1383 and are provided as examples only. Subject to legal review, users can determine if they want to include an SB 1383 or edible food recovery payment of some sort, and if so, how to set and periodically adjust such fees. Users will also need to determine if a nexus fee study is warranted to support these fee amounts. And there's been considerable recent case law about fees, and we also want to recognize that the legal approach in different jurisdictions is very contextual. So again, seek legal counsel in terms of these fees. Given the complexity around compensation and rate setting and the various options that jurisdictions use and jurisdiction-specific considerations, the model does not include any example provisions in Article 10 on compensation and rate setting. Jurisdictions are advised to incorporate their existing provisions or adjust those or negotiate changes as needed. Like the other boilerplate sections I've mentioned, the model doesn't include sample language here in Article 11. Risk managers and legal counsel can develop this article using existing indemnity, insurance, and bonding provisions. I do want to note that there is one exception in that we did provide some example language for SB 1383 indemnification, and this is an optional provision that jurisdictions can consider including in their agreements. Like Article 11, Article 12 primarily consists of placeholder section headings and guidance for jurisdictions to add default and remedy provisions from their existing agreements or to amend them at their options. Some example language has been provided in Section 12.1 of the model to illustrate how jurisdictions may adapt current provisions to make them SB 1383 specific, or how they may add SB 1383 related defaults listed on this slide. Note again that these default provisions are not required under SB 1383 and are optional. With respect to liquidated damages, Section 12.7 provides example performance standards and liquidated damages language and has built-in customization options. An Exhibit F of the model presents liquidated damages for consideration. And once again, these are examples only for consideration and are not required under SB 1383. No content is provided for Articles 13 and 14. Jurisdictions, again, are advised to use their existing provisions and make changes as needed. That wraps up the overview of the main body of the franchise. I'll now briefly provide an overview of the 7 exhibits that are included with the model agreement. Exhibit A and Exhibit B detail collection services to be provided by the contractors to single-family, multifamily, and commercial customers. Various SB 1383 compliant collection system scenarios are provided, including separate exhibits for use of 3, 2, and 1 container systems. If a jurisdiction chooses to comply with SB 1383 using performance-based compliance approach pursuant to Article 17, they have to use a 3 container system, and as a result, they have to use only those exhibits that address the 3 container collection scenarios. Again, delete the exhibits that aren't relevant to the collection system that your jurisdiction has chosen not to use and retain just the system that's relevant. Exhibit C presents sample language detailing the collection services that the collector may provide to a jurisdiction. Exhibit D, construction and demolition debris services, provides detailed language regarding C&D collection services to be provided to the contractor to customers. It's important to recognize that organic waste from C&D needs to be recovered. We also recognize in the guidance notes that sometimes C&D is included in franchise and other times it's excluded. So jurisdictions will need to consider this and decide if it's relevant or not for their agreement. Exhibit E, processing, transfer, and disposal services and facility standards, details facility requirements for the materials that have been collected by the contractor. This exhibit is necessary for agreements that require the contractor to provide or arrange the facilities for transfer, processing, and disposal services, and it includes SB 1383 specific processing facility and monitoring requirements. Exhibit F provides example performance standards and liquidated damages related to SB 1383 program monitoring and reporting requirements. And this exhibit incorporates penalty amounts identified in Article 16 of the SB 1383 regulations. And lastly, Exhibit G provides example record keeping and reporting language to help users meet SB 1383 requirements. As I've mentioned, in terms of the other articles, there's a tremendous amount of guidance notes and optionality so that you can customize these exhibits. I do have slides that provide more detail on each and every exhibit, but we want to be setting us up to provide more time for the audience to ask questions. So I'm just going to click through these slides. They are here, so when the presentation is loaded up onto CalRecycle's website, you'll be able to look at these, or if you have any questions today about the exhibits, feel free to jump in and ask, but I won't go over the content. My last slide focuses on providing some overall tips on how to use the model franchise. So let me just walk through these quickly. The model franchise, as I've mentioned over and over, provides example language, and it tries to provide a wide range of options for customization purposes for all the different types of solutions jurisdictions and their service providers develop. Given the diversity of situations, the model language will need to be customized, and we recognize that it will not be a perfect fit for each jurisdiction, but we do believe that it will provide a very solid foundation to either prepare a brand new agreement or to amend a current agreement to integrate SB 1383 requirements. You'll need to adjust the model language to fit the jurisdiction's specific needs. For example, we've talked a lot about customizing the agreement based on a 3, 2, or 1 container system as appropriate, as well as to reflect what responsibilities and role your contractor will play in contamination, monitoring, education, and other requirements. And you'll find lots of options that will hopefully meet your needs. We recommend blending provisions from the model agreement and the jurisdiction's existing agreement to create an agreement that best suits your needs and requirements. Again, I mentioned there's a lot of places where we didn't provide language that you can insert your boilerplate. When using existing provisions, please be advised to review them and revise them as needed, as well as to revise those definitions to integrate with the other contract language. When customizing the model franchise agreement to align with the jurisdiction's collection and compliance system, as I've mentioned, the definitions need to be reviewed carefully, and a lot of time will need to be put into aligning all of the definitions in the agreement as well as in the ordinance and to meet SB 1383 requirements. While this may seem obvious, you'll need to delete the blue and green highlighted guidance notes in the model when you're preparing your agreement. In cases where the model offers multiple options, optional provisions that are not selected need to be deleted, and your section numbering will need to be modified accordingly. The use of multiple font colors and highlighting to differentiate the content in the model agreement as described above is not required in any final document produced. The model has been designed in accordance with CalRecycle's accessibility guidelines, and SB 1383 does not require any specific styles or design to be used for the agreement. So the final document style is at each jurisdiction's discretion. As noted above, at the beginning of this presentation, each jurisdiction is ultimately responsible for its compliance with the regulations and is advised to seek legal counsel in the development and modification of its agreement. Lastly, I want to mention that CalRecycle, in conjunction with HF&H, developed a series of case studies that spotlight how jurisdictions and entities are implementing some aspects of SB 1383. We created 2 case studies specifically related to franchising, showcasing the recently adopted SB 1383 aligned franchise agreements in the cities of San Ramon and Stockton. You can read about their implementation process and lessons learned by following the links on this slide. That wraps up my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I'll now turn this back over to Ashley for any comments and to facilitate the Q&A process.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Tracy, and great presentation. I think this will ultimately help all of our jurisdictions and stakeholders out there. So now to dive into some questions. So just a quick reminder, this is being recorded and we will post it online along with the PowerPoint once we make everything ADA compliant. So please ensure you're signed up for the listserv to get that notification. And then as a reminder for questions, please try to keep them limited to the model tools. And if you do have a question, we're going to try to take some live questions. So just please put an asterisk in the question feature on GoToMeeting, and you will be called upon once you're unmuted. So for the first question, we have...
Hi, I'm Colleen. I have unmuted you. So if you unmute yourself, you'll be able to ask your question. And again, please state your name and affiliation. Colleen, I'll go ahead and read your question. This question is...
Okay, I'm muted now. Sorry, for some reason it wouldn't let me unmute. Can you hear me? Hi, Ashley. Hi. Sorry. Thank you. Colleen Foster, City of Oceanside. Hi, Kara. Hi, everybody. I wanted to ask the question. I asked the question basically, and this is directed towards HF&H. What is the average time frame to design, distribute an RFP, negotiate, and go through the full procurement of a solid waste franchise agreement?
Good question, Colleen. Obviously, depends a bit on whether you're amending an existing agreement or going out to the competitive marketplace. If you're amending the existing agreement, it could be done in 3 to 6 months plus some implementation time on the contractor's part. If you're doing a competitive RFP process, you probably need about 2 years, 1 year to conduct the process and 1 year for the contractor to implement the new services. The long lead time on that has to do with acquisition of trucks primarily that are taking 11 to 14 months these days.
Great, thank you. I just think that's important to recognize that difference. The second follow-up to that is from a market analysis, and this regulation is very new to many jurisdictions. So we're kind of starting at point one. Would it be recommended to go out to recruitment, RFP recruitment, just to get a market rate for all of these services?
From HF&H's perspective, we advise clients on a case-by-case basis, and there are a lot of facts that we would consider in deciding whether amending or going out to the marketplace was the right choice. And so I'm cautious to give any guidance on a statewide webinar about what 500 jurisdictions might do, because there really are a huge number of local facts involved in that decision making.
That is true. I appreciate that. I understand that answer, Rob. So I've gone through both a contract negotiation amendment, and now I'm going through a competitive recruitment. And even the negotiation took about a year from deciding to negotiate to making it happen. And competitive recruitment, we're looking at 2 years. So just wanted as a point of reference that this is a big task at hand, and we appreciate your model documents.
Thank you.
Colleen, thank you so much for that question. I think just for everyone on the webinar, I also wanted to share that, Rob providing the example of the difference in timeframes. Again, CalRecycle is going to take that into consideration. We understand that jurisdictions were waiting for these model tools, and now you have these tools at hand and can begin some of the changes that you need to implement. And today we're talking about franchise agreements. So, in the example, if a jurisdiction needed to go out to the market for a new RFP and knowing that it could take up to 2 years, certainly CalRecycle would take that into consideration. And with respect to the recent compliance guidance document that we provided, We acknowledge that there are some jurisdictions that won't hit January 1 for all of their program implementation for a number of reasons, particularly for COVID, waiting for these resources, waiting for the regulation to be approved. So again, CalRecycle is going to take each jurisdiction situation into consideration. CalRecycle's focus is on compliance assistance first. We have discretion not to initiate enforcement action, and so a jurisdiction certainly that's embarking on an RFP process, and that's going to take time, CalRecycle would certainly take that into consideration. The most important thing for jurisdictions at this point is to be communicating with their local assistants and market development liaison about their timing issues and what their plans are for moving forward. Thanks so much, Colleen. We always appreciate your comments and questions.
All right, our next question is from Gabe. Gabe, please unmute yourself so you can ask your question, and please state your name and affiliation. All right, our next question is from Rebecca. Rebecca, please unmute yourself to ask your question.
You? That's a different Rebecca, right?
Okay, I will ask Rebecca's question. Her question is, do the blue, green, and gray container color requirements apply to roll-off boxes and compactors too?
HF&H, would you like to go first, and then we could chime in?
I think actually, well, the model agreement addresses the color requirements for all containers, including the roll-off boxes. And I know there's certainly been some question around those requirements. So I think Kara or Alan asked to chime in on CalRecycle's perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. So yes, the color requirements do apply to all containers. It's important to keep in mind that the regulations allow for phasing in containers, and we can talk about that in more detail if you'd like us to follow up. Additionally, we recognize that while containers are being phased in, there may be an opportunity just to have appropriate signage on that container until that container is phased in with the appropriate color. So we will have a frequently asked question that will be coming out soon after the regulations are approved that gets into details on this. But if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to shoot us an email and we can set up a follow-up conversation. Thanks, Tracy.
All right, our next question is from Neil. Neil Shapiro, if you unmute your phone, you can ask your question, and please, again, identify your affiliation.
Can you hear me? Okay, sounds good. Yeah. Hi there, Neil Shapiro, City Santa Monica. Thank you for someone responding about the colors since we have all black. And didn't want to have to switch to gray, but it sounds like black is okay, acceptable. My other question is, can you, and maybe I missed it, I apologize, and maybe it's defined in the template, the difference between standard versus performance-based requirements.
Tracy, do you want to take that one on first?
Sure. Article 3 of the SB 1383 lays out a whole range of the collection options. That's where a 3-container, a 2-container, and an unsegregated container system are identified. It also addresses things like split container or uncontainerized service like loose and street yard trimmings. We call that the standard compliance approach. There's an Article 17 in the regulations that outlines what's called a performance-based compliance approach. Under this scenario, it requires that a 3-container system be provided to all generators, that 90% of the single family and then 90% of the multifamily and commercial customers subscribe to those collection services. It also requires that waste evaluations are done, sorting the gray container materials to examine the amount of organic waste that remains in the gray container and to reach a threshold compliance of 20%, or is it 25%, Kara?
25.
25%. And it allows jurisdictions that meet these requirements to eliminate some of the reporting that's defined for the standard compliance approach. So there's a lot less reporting requirements, but there are these additional standards that need to be achieved. Please fill any gaps in if I've missed anything, Kara.
No, I think you covered it well. And Neil, if you have further questions on performance-based, we're happy to set up a follow-up call. Just contact your local assistance market development liaison. I think that's Lena, and we'll get something set up with you. And also one more point, again, I'm going to make a plug for the frequently asked questions. We also are developing some new web pages with respect to the regulatory requirements, and we will have a web page that is focused on performance-based systems. So that should answer a lot of questions that you might have as well. And that should be coming out shortly after the regulations are approved.
All right, our next question is from Kanya. Kanya, please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your name and affiliation. Okay, I'm going to ask Kanya's question for her. Will CalRecycle develop any tools to assist in tracking and reporting for SB 1383?
Sure, Kanya, thanks so much for the question. Yeah, we have a team that's been created that will be developing the reporting for the electronic annual reporting system for jurisdictions. As we develop what will be required, this is actually all laid out in Article 13 of the regulations. But as we roll it out, we'll provide training for jurisdictions, as well as another big piece of the regulations is the implementation record. And for those of you that participate in the regulatory process, you are very familiar with the tremendous feedback we had about concerns about requiring too much to be reported in the annual report. So with stakeholder input, we created the implementation record, which allows a jurisdiction to maintain particular records that validate their compliance with the regulation, but they don't have to submit all of that data to CalRecycle. To assist jurisdictions, we will be developing a tool that will help jurisdictions to maintain their electronic implementation record on site and electronically. So stay tuned for that. I don't have a timeline yet for that tool, but it will probably second quarter to third quarter, probably next summer, we'll have that available. And we'll make sure that we provide training to jurisdictions on utilizing that. But we hope that tool will be very helpful. I think also with the annual reporting system, we hope to keep that as streamlined as possible. And anything that is duplicative with reporting with 1383 versus other reporting you've been doing, the team will be assessing that, and we will ensure that we avoid any duplication of reporting.
All right, it looks like Peter Sloat has a question for Tracy. So Peter, if you can unmute yourself.
Good morning, can you hear me? Thank you. Tracy, if I understood correctly, hang on for a moment, let me get the right. If I understood correctly, I believe that you said that a jurisdiction is not responsible for or may be excused from enforcing compliance at generators that are not subject to a jurisdiction's exclusive franchise. Would that include generators such as a state university, a school district, an airport, that although they are not legally subject to a jurisdiction's franchise, that nevertheless use franchise services? Would such generators, would the jurisdiction be excused from ensuring compliance at such generators?
Peter, I think the issue isn't so much to do with the scope or authority of your franchise as it does the scope or authority of your jurisdiction. And so essentially, because these are state agencies and you're a city, you can't regulate those state agencies, and it falls on another state agency to do that regulation for you. So while it overlaps with this issue of franchise and franchise exclusivity, it's really state agencies and super governmental agencies.
So I think the short answer is yes. And that could potentially be applied to any entity that is covered under that sort of state agency. It's a state recognized agency. It could be a university offices, port. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, and Peter, just to add to that, in the regulations, we define these entities into two categories. We call them either non-local entities or local education agencies. So if you have any other follow-ups, please feel free to let us know. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
All right, our next question is from Cindy. Cindy, please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your name and affiliation.
Hello. Hi, my name is Cindy. I'm from the California Science Center. We're a department under the Natural Resources Agency. So I wanted to know specifically how like this applied to us. We're considered a district under the, District Agricultural Association. So I wanted to know if we're considered a special district, because I read that special districts are not subject to the same, procurement requirements. So I wanted to know if that applied to us, or like how my department needs to, like how these regulations apply to us specifically, if you guys know.
Hey, Cindy, thanks for your question. You're right. Your situation is a little bit unique. But from what you've described, and we can do a follow-up if needed, but from what you've described, you guys would fall under the non-local entity criteria or definition. And as such, you would be subject to all of those requirements for non-local entities. With respect to your question about special districts that provide solid waste collection services, let's see. Yes, that is correct. They are not subject to the organic waste product procurement requirements. But I think if you're asking about yourself as an entity, we can do a follow-up with respect to any other state requirements for procurement. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Okay, our next question is from Anna Luke Jones. We've unmuted you, so if you unmute yourself, you can ask your questions. And remember to state your affiliation, please.
Stop sharing my screen. It'll be time to see it soon, okay? All right, and Christian, what would you like to say? Adrian?
Anna? Okay. We have you unmuted if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, I'm sorry about that. I'm helping my kids distance learn at the same time.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
I just wanted to know if the container colors apply to public containers, because we have some containers on city streets that do have shades of blue and shades of green. And so is that going to fall under that type of coordination?
HF&H, do you want to take that first and we'll chime in?
Our understanding is that the public litter containers do not have to comply with the color requirements. And I just want to say a big shout out to Anna Luke Jones, who is part of our resource team and reviewed documents and provided comments. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, our next question is from Jennifer. Jennifer, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question, and please state your name and affiliation.
Hi, this is Hale. Hi, Shreya. Hi, Gwen. Gwen, what would you like to say?
Hi, this is Jennifer Gilbert with the City of Davis. So my question is about the C&D bins and roll-off boxes. On page 134 of your model franchise agreement, you mentioned that the roll-off boxes, they may be, because this is a big question that we've had, since the beginning about this is roll-off boxes and C&D boxes, because as I'm sure you know, typically haulers will use them kind of interchangeably, right? Like one week, the roll-off box is for trash, the next week it's for, but you're saying specifically here that's not possible anymore. And I'm just wondering if in this process of developing this model agreement, developing this language, I mean, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm going to tell my hauler they're going to have extra bins because they're using bins and they can't be the same color for C&D and trash. So I would really love to hear a little bit more about the process behind how it was determined that this is going to be, and not just from HF and H, which I do want to hear here, but I want to hear from CalRecycle as well about that. Thank you.
Let me just start in terms of the model agreement. I do want to note that the regulations do not require the color compliance unless there are new containers into 2036. So there's a lot of time to be transitioning, so that we've built in provisions that address if you've got new containers, the requirement to be compliant from the get-go. If you've got existing containers, how you can transition over time. We've also got language in there about painting bins and roll-off boxes to become color compliant. So I think we've provided a lot of optionality around that compliance, and CalRecycle can talk a little bit about the background and how that decision was made to include that requirement in the reg.
Sure. Tracy, thanks so much. That was a great job responding to the background. Through the regulatory process, container colors were one of the biggest topics over the last 3.5 years. We spent a lot of time talking to jurisdictions and haulers about these requirements. And exactly as Tracy said, that's why we came up with the phasing in of containers. Existing stock that's purchased prior to January 1, 2022 can continue to be used until the end of 2036. And also, we are looking at, the option you can phase in your containers. I appreciate the challenge with the big roll-off containers. And we've had conversations with a number of haulers and how they're going to deal with that. But again, the phasing in, I think, is key. Oftentimes, these containers can be labeled with the correct colors, and that would be an option during this time frame. But Jennifer, we're happy to do a follow-up with you and your hauler to talk about what options you have between, when the regs take effect until January or 2036. We're happy to have those conversations with you. Again, we understand that containers can be one of the biggest costs in a collection program. And again, that's why we built in the flexibility that we did into the regulations. Does that help, Jennifer?
Yeah, that does help a lot. The phasing in is going to help us a lot. As far as the labeling goes, I mean, how does a roll-off bin, how does that work with the labeling? Because the labels have to be, what can and cannot go. Can we put just temporary signs on each of these bins each time? Is that considered acceptable?
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
Now?
Absolutely. And that's what we've heard that some haulers are doing for those types of containers. So that would be totally A-okay.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Kara and Ashley, for all your work on this. And Alan, oh my gosh, it's so great to see you. So thanks, everyone.
All right, our next question is from Mark Bowers. We have you unmuted, so if you can unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Mark Bowers. I'm working part-time for Sunnyvale and separately working part-time for Morgan Hill, cities of, in both cases. And my question was about scrap lumber, which is organic under the definitions, and which of the 3 container colors would it go into? The recycling MRFs don't generally want to have lumber coming into them, but the curbside materials and our yard trimmings processors aren't real happy about getting scrap lumber. And then obviously it's not wanting to go to the landfill, so you don't want to put it in the gray container. What's the best approach there?
Tracy, Rob, do you want to take that on and I could add on?
All right, well, I'll start. first of all, you're right, Mark, that you have to figure out what to do with that lumber. The regulations do allow for it to be placed in either the green or blue container. And so I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all answer that I can provide, meaning it's really going to depend on what those local facilities are and what those facilities are capable of doing now, or what you negotiate that they will be able to do in the future. So it may be that the recycling facility will end up handling it. It may be that your organics facility will handle it, or maybe you'll have to think about collecting it in a different way, whether that's some sort of, special pickup or bulky to capture those materials separately, or to have drop-offs. There might be different types of solutions that each jurisdiction will need to craft for their needs. And we do address this to some extent in the model in terms of the defined terms and where that wood is placed.
Mark, does that help? Tracy, that was perfect. I have nothing else to add.
Yes, thank you.
All right, our next question is from Shinsi. Shinsi, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, this is Zinsi Tan with Zero Waste Sonoma. I'm wondering if you can give me more information on the statewide characterization study to be conducted in the next year, and if you can tell us when you would anticipate the results to be available.
That's a great question. As you guys know, when we first contracted for the statewide characterization, COVID was not around. Now that COVID's here and we have some unforeseen circumstances, we are a little bit delayed on doing the waste characterization study, but I believe they're starting to solicit sometime soon. However, with that said, it's going to be a little bit more difficult this year and probably going into next year. So we don't know when we're going to have the results available yet. But I'm sure we'll keep you informed through some type of listserv that we have. If not, you could follow up with me directly. This is Ashley. You could follow up with me directly and I'll get you to the right person.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, our next question is from Colleen Foster. So if you unmute, Colleen, you're ready to go.
Yes, it was in regards to reporting. I'm wondering, when will reporting formats be available? Will we get advanced lead time on SB 1383 reports and formats? Basically, previously annual reports, generally the report system would be open something like 30 or 45 days prior. And we're fairly used to those questions. I think in order to help everyone, it'd be beneficial to get the reporting questions and requirements in advance of January 1st, 2022, so we can build and prepare responses into our actual programming.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colleen. I don't have the specific date, but our goal with the reporting team is to provide mock-ups when they're ready. To get that out, that's usually what we do when we're building any new reporting aspects of the annual reporting system. So I'm shooting for spring, early summer, so that jurisdictions can see what they look like. I think what's key is that what we are doing is we're building it off of Article 13. So everything that's in Article 13, if you're a jurisdiction that's subject to reporting on those, because obviously for low pop, there are some things that jurisdictions that have waivers don't have to report on. So you'll be able to see in there exactly what will be asked for in the annual report. What we will be developing is whether a question will either be a drop down, a yes, no, a fill in with text. So I do expect probably a spring, summer that those mock-ups will be available. We do plan to provide training to local jurisdictions well in advance of the first annual reporting due dates. So I don't have that time frame yet, but we will be sure to send out notices on the jurisdiction listserv so you know when things are coming available. But that certainly is our goal, and thank you so much for that feedback. Early is better, so you can plan.
Thank you.
All right, our next question is from Deborah. Deborah, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question. Okay, I will ask Deborah's question. Who is responsible for overlay districts that fall within a segment of a city or county limit, like a sanitary district? Are these subject to state or local regulation?
Rob, Tracy, do you want to take that one first and we'll chime in?
Happy to, and it looks like Sharon Mitchell from San Bernardino County has a similar question about special districts and CSDs that provide solid waste service. So essentially, a CSD or a special district that has solid waste powers assigned to them through their local agency formation council, their LAFCO, has the ability to perform those services and provide those services to that area, and they would be the jurisdiction in that case. Now, with respect to the procurement of organic waste, special districts do not have the procurement obligation, and that obligation is placed on their parent agency. So if the CSD is completely subsumed within a city, it would be the city's obligation. If, on the other hand, it was within an unincorporated area, it would be the unincorporated area's obligation. And if it's split between the two, it's based on population anyways, so it would just fall into the population of the city and the county.
Yeah, and thanks, Rob. That was perfect. And then just to add on to that, so these special districts that provide solid waste handling services are included in the regulatory definition of a jurisdiction. So everywhere you see in the regs where it uses the word jurisdiction, that is including those special districts that provide solid waste collection services. It will be new for them to report in the annual report, but they will be reporting. We have been interacting with the statewide association of special districts and just recently did a webinar for them specifically, and many of them are ready and prepared, so that was great to see. Also, I think it's important to note that with addition to the annual report, special districts that provide solid waste collection services are also subject to the edible food requirements. So to the degree that within that special district, they have either tier 1 or tier 2 generators, they will be responsible for implementing an edible food program. And also same goes with capacity planning. They will be one of the jurisdiction types that participate in that planning process. But as I mentioned, we've been doing a lot of outreach to the special districts, and that outreach has been going quite well, and they all seem to be very prepared and aware of the regulatory requirements that are coming for them. Thank you for the question.
So thank you guys all for participating and asking these questions. We have run out of time. I see that there are some more questions, so we'll get those written down, and we will contact you guys for the responses for those. And then feel free to contact, as we mentioned earlier, your local assistance and market development representative, or you could email your questions or your other questions to the SLCP inbox. I would like to thank all of you guys for participating. And as a friendly reminder, today at 1 o'clock, we will have the model ordinance. So you'll see us back here at 1 o'clock. So thank you guys all for participating. And again, these will be recorded and posted online. So have a great day, and hopefully see you at 1 o'clock.